The leather-bound volume of Shakespeare slipped from Zelda Carson's trembling fingers and landed in the dusty street of Fort Garland, Colorado, its pages splaying open like a wounded bird as her father's hand connected with her shoulder in a forceful shove that sent her stumbling backward off their front porch. It was July of 1883, and the summer sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town nestled in the San Luis Valley, where the Sangre de Cristo Mountains loomed in the distance like silent witnesses to her humiliation. "No daughter of mine will waste her time with such nonsense," Tobias Carson bellowed, his weathered face red with fury as neighbors paused in their daily routines to witness the spectacle. "Reading fills a woman's head with foolish notions and makes her unfit for a decent man." Zelda, 22 years old with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like burnished copper, scrambled to retrieve her beloved book from the dirt, her green eyes burning with unshed tears. Her mother, Martha, stood silent in the doorway, her expression a mixture of pity and resignation, but she made no move to defend her daughter. This was not the first time Tobias had discovered Zelda's secret cache of books, purchased with money she earned doing laundry and mending for the townspeople, but his rage seemed to grow more intense with each discovery. "You will marry Samuel Bridger next month as we have arranged," her father continued, stepping down from the porch to loom over her. "He has a good cattle ranch and needs a proper wife who will cook, clean, and bear him sons. Not some addled woman who thinks she is better than her station because she can read fancy words." The crowd of onlookers murmured their agreement. Fort Garland was a practical town of ranchers, miners, and soldiers from the nearby military post. Books were luxuries most could not afford, and education beyond the basics was considered unnecessary, particularly for women. Zelda had learned to read from the previous schoolteacher, an elderly woman from Boston who had encouraged her love of literature before dying of consumption 2 winters ago. Since then, Zelda had hidden her passion for reading, but her father had grown suspicious of how she spent her free time. "I will not marry Samuel Bridger," Zelda said quietly, clutching the book to her chest. "He is cruel to his horses and his hired men. I have seen the bruises on them." Her father's face darkened further. "You will do as you are told, or you will find yourself without a home or family. Is that understood?" Before Zelda could respond, a deep voice cut through the tense silence. Miss Carson dropped something. All eyes turned to the man on horseback, who had pulled up at the edge of the gathering crowd. He was tall in the saddle, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of coffee. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, dusty from the trail, but there was something in his bearing that commanded attention. He swung down from his horse with easy grace and bent to pick up a small ribbon bookmark that had fallen from Zelda's volume. "Quinton Xavier," Tobias acknowledged with a curt nod. "I heard you were back in the valley. Thought you were working a spread down near Santa Fe." "Was," Quinton said simply, his gaze moving from Tobias to Zelda. He stepped forward and held out the bookmark to her. "That was quite a fall." "Are you injured, miss?" Zelda shook her head, acutely aware of every eye upon them. She reached for the bookmark, and their fingers brushed for the briefest moment. His hands were calloused from hard work, but his touch was gentle. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier. I am quite well." "Clumsy is what she is," Tobias interjected. "Always has her nose in a book instead of paying attention to her duties. Now, if you will excuse us, this is a family matter." Quinton's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes as he glanced at the book Zelda held. "Romeo and Juliet. That is a fine choice. My mother read that to me and my sister when we were young. She believed stories taught us about the human heart in ways that regular conversation could not." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Tobias looked affronted that this cowboy, barely 30 years old by Zelda's estimation, would dare contradict the prevailing opinion about books and women. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond to this unexpected development. "Your mother must have been an unusual woman," Tobias said stiffly. "She was educated at a seminary in Philadelphia before she came west with my father," Quinton replied. "She taught school for a time before I was born. She passed 5 years ago, but she left me her entire library. Nearly 80 volumes." Zelda could not help the small gasp that escaped her lips. 80 books was a fortune beyond her wildest dreams. Her own collection had numbered just 12 before her father had discovered and burned most of them last winter. Quinton turned to her again, and this time the ghost of a smile touched his lips. "If you are ever interested in borrowing something to read, Miss Carson, you would be most welcome. I have recently taken over the old Henderson place, about 5 miles northeast of town. The offer stands for anyone who appreciates good literature." With that, he tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode off, leaving Zelda staring after him with her heart beating strangely fast in her chest. Her father grabbed her arm and hauled her into the house, slamming the door behind them, but for the first time in months, Zelda felt a small spark of hope kindle in her chest. The following days passed in a blur of arguments and tension. Tobias forbade Zelda from leaving the property except to attend church on Sunday, and he watched her like a hawk to ensure she had no contact with books or with Quinton Xavier. Samuel Bridger visited twice, a heavy-set man of 45 with thinning hair and small, mean eyes that lingered too long on Zelda's figure. He spoke of her as though she were a brood mare he was considering purchasing, discussing her child-bearing hips and strong teeth with her father while she stood silent and seething. "The wedding will be at the end of August," Tobias announced over supper one evening. "Samuel has already paid the bride price. Everything is settled." "You sold me?" Zelda asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Like a horse or a piece of furniture, I secured your future," her father snapped, "which is more than you deserve given your defiant nature. Samuel is willing to overlook your unfortunate reading habit. He assures me he will correct such behavior once you are wed." That night, Zelda lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling and contemplating her limited options. She had no money of her own beyond a few coins hidden in her mattress, nowhere to go, and no skills beyond housekeeping that would earn her a living in this rough country. Women alone on the frontier faced dangers and hardships that made even marriage to Samuel Bridger seem preferable to some. But the thought of Quinton Xavier's library haunted her. 80 books, and he had invited her to borrow from them, had spoken of literature with respect and understanding. She knew nothing about him, except that he was a cowboy who had recently purchased a ranch, that his mother had been educated, and that he looked at her as though she were a person rather than a problem to be solved. Sunday arrived, bringing with it the stifling heat that characterized Colorado summers at 7,000 feet elevation. Zelda dressed in her only good dress, a simple cotton affair in pale blue, and accompanied her parents to the small wooden church that served Fort Garland's faithful. She barely heard the minister's sermon, her mind wandering to forbidden thoughts of escape and independence. When the service concluded, the congregation spilled out into the bright sunshine, the women clustering to gossip while the men discussed cattle prices and the recent trouble with horse thieves operating in the area. Zelda stood apart from the other young women her age, most of whom had already married and started families. They had never been unkind to her exactly, but they viewed her reading habit with the same mixture of suspicion and pity that most of the town did. "Miss Carson." She turned to find Quinton Xavier approaching, dressed in clean clothes that suggested he had made an effort for church, though she had not noticed him during the service. Up close and in better light, she could see that his eyes were actually a warm brown with flecks of gold, and that he had a small scar above his left eyebrow. "Mr. Xavier," she greeted him cautiously, aware that her father was watching from across the yard. "I wanted to renew my invitation for you to visit my library," he said without preamble. "I recently finished building proper shelves for the books, and I thought you might appreciate seeing them properly displayed." "That is very kind, but my father would not approve," Zelda said quietly, though every fiber of her being wanted to accept. "Would he approve if you were chaperoned?" Quinton asked. "I could ask Mrs. Patterson to accompany you. She helps me with cooking and cleaning once a week, and she is a respectable widow. Your father could hardly object to that arrangement." Zelda glanced at the woman in question, a sturdy matron of 60 who had lost her husband to a mining accident 3 years prior. Mrs. Patterson was known for her no-nonsense attitude and her fierce defense of propriety. "I do not think," Zelda began, but Quinton interrupted her gently. "Forgive my boldness, Miss Carson, but I heard in town that you are engaged to Samuel Bridger. I knew Sam when we were boys, and I know what kind of man he grew into. If you marry him, you will never read another book as long as you live. He will make certain of that. So perhaps you should take what opportunities for learning and beauty you can while you still have the freedom to do so." His words struck her like a physical blow because they articulated the fear that had been growing in her heart. Once she became Mrs. Samuel Bridger, her life would be one of drudgery and subjugation. Samuel had already made it clear that he expected absolute obedience from his wife, and his first wife had died under mysterious circumstances that the doctor had attributed to a fall, though there had been whispers of something more sinister. "Tuesday afternoon," she whispered. "My mother goes to her sewing circle and my father will be working at the livery stable. I could claim I am delivering mending to Mrs. Patterson." Quinton's expression brightened. "I will arrange everything. 2 o'clock. Yes." He nodded and walked away before her father could cross the yard to investigate their conversation. Zelda's heart hammered in her chest with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was taking a risk, but the thought of seeing 80 books, of being surrounded by such wealth of knowledge and story, was worth almost any danger. Tuesday dawned clear and hot. Zelda completed her morning chores with unusual efficiency, helping her mother prepare food for the sewing circle and tidying the small house until it gleamed. When Martha left at 1 o'clock, Zelda changed into a fresh dress, pinned her hair up neatly, and walked the half-mile to Mrs. Patterson's cottage on the edge of town. "You are right on time," the older woman said approvingly when Zelda knocked. "Mr. Xavier sent his wagon for us. Very proper of him. He is a good man, that one. His mother raised him right." They climbed into the wagon driven by a weathered ranch hand named Pete, who tipped his hat politely, but said nothing during the drive to the Henderson place. Zelda watched the landscape roll past, the scrub grass and pinon pines giving way to better grazing land as they moved northeast into the valley. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains dominated the eastern horizon, their peaks still holding patches of snow even in July. The Henderson place turned out to be a modest ranch with a house that was larger than Zelda had expected. It was built of adobe and wood in the Spanish style, with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides and actual glass windows, which was a luxury in this part of Colorado. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the property, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, their hides sleek and healthy-looking. Quinton emerged from the house as the wagon pulled up, and Zelda noticed he had shaved and put on a clean shirt. "Mrs. Patterson, Miss Carson, welcome." Please come in." The interior of the house was cool and surprisingly well furnished. Zelda had expected the rough bachelor quarters typical of most cowboys, but someone had taken care with this place. There were curtains on the windows, a proper table and chairs in the dining area, and braided rugs on the plank floors. "My sister helped me fix it up before she returned to Santa Fe," Quinton explained, noticing Zelda's surprise. "Hannah believes that just because a man lives alone is no excuse for dwelling in squalor. The library is through here." He led them through a doorway into a room that made Zelda's breath catch in her throat. The space was not large, perhaps 12 feet by 15, but every wall was lined with shelves, and every shelf was filled with books. They were arranged by category, she noticed, with literature on one wall, history and philosophy on another, and practical volumes about ranching, animal husbandry, and agriculture on the third. The fourth wall held a window with a comfortable chair positioned to catch the light, and a small desk with writing materials. "Oh," Zelda breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. She had never seen so many books in one place. Even the general store in town only carried a handful of dime novels and agricultural almanacs. "You are welcome to borrow any that interest you," Quinton said quietly. "I only ask that you take care of them and return them when you have finished." Zelda moved to the literature section as though drawn by an invisible thread. Her fingers traced the spines reverently. Hawthorne, Melville, Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen, Walt Whitman. Authors she had only heard mentioned in passing, whose works she had longed to read but never thought she would have the opportunity to hold in her hands. "I will put coffee on," Mrs. Patterson announced tactfully. "You young people take your time looking at books. I will call you when it is ready." Left alone with Quinton, Zelda felt suddenly shy. She was intensely aware of his presence behind her, of the impropriety of being in his home even with Mrs. Patterson as chaperone. But when she glanced at him, he was simply watching her with a gentle expression that held no threat or judgment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You do not know me. We have spoken perhaps 3 times in our entire lives before last Sunday." Quinton was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Do you know how many people in Fort Garland can read beyond a basic level? Perhaps 20 out of a population of 500. And of those 20, how many do you think care about literature, about ideas, about the life of the mind? 5, maybe 6. It is lonely to have all these books and no one to discuss them with. My mother used to say that books were meant to be shared, that stories created connections between people. I suppose I am doing this as much for myself as for you." "I see," Zelda said, though she was not entirely convinced that was his only motivation. She turned back to the shelves, selecting a volume of Emily Dickinson's poetry. "May I borrow this one, of course. Take as many as you like. Just one for now. If my father finds it, I will say I borrowed it from Mrs. Patterson. He knows she can read." Quinton's jaw tightened. "Does he hurt you? Physically, I mean?" "Not often. A slap here and there when his temper gets the better of him. Nothing that leaves lasting marks." "That is still too much," Quinton said fiercely. "No man should raise his hand to a woman, regardless of provocation." Zelda looked at him in surprise. Such sentiment was uncommon among the men of her acquaintance, who generally believed that a man had the right to discipline his wife and children as he saw fit. "You really are different from other men, aren't you?" "I had a father who never once struck my mother or my sister or me, even when we likely deserved it," Quinton said. "He believed that violence was the refuge of weak minds, that a real man used his words and his reason, not his fists. I try to live by his example." They talked then, standing among the books like conspirators sharing secrets. Quinton asked her what she liked to read, and Zelda found herself opening up in ways she never had before, speaking of how stories transported her beyond the narrow confines of Fort Garland, how they showed her different ways of thinking and living, how they made her feel less alone. He listened with genuine interest, sometimes agreeing, sometimes offering different perspectives that challenged her thinking in exciting ways. Mrs. Patterson called them for coffee eventually, and they sat in the main room drinking strong brew and eating cake the older woman had brought from town. The afternoon passed too quickly, and when Pete brought the wagon around at 4 o'clock, Zelda felt a sharp pang of disappointment. "You can come back next Tuesday if you like," Quinton said as he helped her into the wagon. "Same time, same arrangement, that is, if you wish to." "I wish to very much," Zelda admitted, "but I worry about what people will say, what my father will do if he discovers I am coming here." "Let me worry about your father," Quinton said with a confidence that both reassured and frightened her. "For now, just enjoy the poetry." The following week crawled by with agonizing slowness. Zelda hid the Dickinson volume in her mattress and read by candlelight late at night when her parents were asleep. The poems spoke to her soul, especially the ones about nature and solitude and the inner life of the mind. She memorized her favorites, knowing she might have to return the book sooner than she wished. Samuel Bridger visited again on Friday, bringing her father a bottle of whiskey and discussing wedding arrangements. He barely acknowledged Zelda beyond a perfunctory greeting, which suited her fine. She served them coffee and then retreated to the kitchen, where she could hear them talking through the thin walls. "The girl is headstrong," Samuel said, "but I will train her proper once she is mine. My first wife was flighty too when we married, but she learned soon enough to keep her thoughts to herself and do as she was told." Tobias chuckled. "Zelda needs a firm hand. Her mother spoiled her when she was young, teaching her letters and such. I should have put a stop to it sooner." "Well, she will have no time for reading once she is keeping my house and bearing my children. I expect her to give me sons, strong boys to work the ranch." Zelda gripped the counter until her knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to march into the room and tell both men exactly what she thought of their plans for her future. But she held her tongue because she had learned that open defiance only led to harsher restrictions and closer surveillance. Tuesday came again, and Zelda made her excuses to slip away to Mrs. Patterson's cottage. The older woman was becoming invested in the scheme, she realized, treating it like an adventure that broke the monotony of frontier life. "Mr. Xavier asked me to tell you that he found a first edition of Wuthering Heights in his mother's trunk," Mrs. Patterson said as they rode to the ranch. "He thought you might enjoy it." At the ranch, Quinton greeted them with a smile that made Zelda's stomach flutter in a way she had never experienced before. He showed her the Bronte novel, and they spent 2 hours discussing literature, life, and philosophy while Mrs. Patterson dozed in a chair on the porch. Somewhere during that conversation, sitting in the library with dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight, Zelda realized she was falling in love with this cowboy who valued books and ideas, who treated her as an equal, who listened to her opinions as though they mattered. The realization terrified her. She was engaged to another man, trapped by her father's arrangements and society's expectations. Even if she were free, what future could she have with Quinton? He was a rancher trying to build a life in difficult country. He needed a practical wife who could handle the harsh realities of frontier existence, not a dreamer who lived half her life in books. But when Quinton walked her to the wagon that day, he caught her hand and held it for just a moment. "I look forward to seeing you next week, Miss Carson. These afternoons have become very precious to me." "And to me," she whispered, her heart racing, Over the following weeks, their Tuesday meetings became the center of Zelda's existence. She would borrow a book, read it voraciously throughout the week, and return it the following Tuesday to discuss what she had learned and borrow another. But increasingly, the books became secondary to the joy of simply being in Quinton's company. They talked about everything under the sun, their conversations ranging from serious discussions of philosophy and politics to silly debates about whether cats or dogs made better companions. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a knowing and sympathetic chaperone. She gave them privacy while maintaining propriety, and she never once suggested that their growing attachment was inappropriate, though surely she could see what was developing between them. One Tuesday in early August, Zelda arrived to find Quinton waiting on the porch with an expression that was both nervous and excited. "I have something to show you," he said, "if you would like to see it." He led her around to the side of the house, where a new structure stood that had not been there the previous week. It was a small building, perhaps 20 feet by 30, built of the same adobe and wood as the main house. The door stood open, and when Zelda stepped inside, she gasped. The entire interior was one large room lined with empty shelves that reached from floor to ceiling. A large window on the south wall flooded the space with light, and there were 2 comfortable chairs positioned near a fireplace that would keep the room warm in winter. It was beautiful in its simplicity, clearly designed for one purpose. "A library," she breathed. "You built a library." "I have been thinking," Quinton said, his voice uncertain in a way she had never heard before. "These books deserve a proper home, not to be crammed into a small room in the main house. And I thought if I ever married, my wife might appreciate having a dedicated space for reading and study. Somewhere she could be alone with her thoughts when she needed solitude." Zelda turned to look at him, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Your wife would be a very fortunate woman." "Zelda," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "I know you are engaged to Samuel Bridger. I know I have no right to interfere in arrangements that have been made, but I cannot let you marry him without telling you that I have fallen in love with you. These past weeks, getting to know your mind and your heart, have been the happiest of my life. If you feel even a fraction of what I feel, please do not go through with this wedding. Stay here with me. Marry me instead." The room spun around her. Everything she had dreamed of in her secret heart was being offered to her freely, and yet the reality of her situation crashed down like a weight. "Quinton, I cannot. My father has accepted money from Samuel. He will never let me back out of the engagement, and even if I ran away, where would I go? Samuel would come after me. He is not a man who accepts being crossed." "I am not afraid of Samuel Bridger," Quinton said firmly. "And I have money. I sold my share of the ranch in Santa Fe for a good price, and this place is prospering. I can pay your father back whatever bride price he accepted. I will go to him today if you will have me." "He will refuse," Zelda said, tears streaming down her face. "He hates that I raid. He thinks I am defective because I want more than to cook and clean and bear children. He will never allow me to marry a man who encourages what he sees as my worst traits." "Then come away with me," Quinton urged, taking her hands in his. "We will go to Denver or Santa Fe or anywhere you wish. Start fresh where no one knows us. And abandon my mother. Leave her alone with him. He will take his anger out on her." Zelda pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. "You do not understand what my father is capable of when he is crossed. He will make everyone suffer." Quinton's expression hardened. "Then I will speak to him man to man. Offer him twice what Samuel paid. Make him understand that you will be well cared for and that his honor will not be impugned. It is worth trying, Zelda. We are worth trying for." She looked at him through her tears. This good man who had built her a library, who loved her not in spite of her passion for reading but because of it. The thought of spending her life with him, surrounded by books and genuine affection, was so tempting it hurt. But she knew her father, knew his pride and his stubbornness. "If you truly love me, you will try," she said finally. "But please, Quinton, be careful. My father is not a reasonable man." That evening, Quinton rode into Fort Garland and presented himself at the Carson home. Zelda had returned hours earlier with Mrs. Patterson, her eyes still red from crying. When she heard the knock on the door and opened it to find Quinton standing there in his best clothes, his hat in his hands, her breath caught. "Mr. Carson," Quinton said when Tobias appeared behind his daughter, "I would like to speak with you about a matter of great importance." "Say what you have to say," Tobias replied coldly. "I wish to marry your daughter, sir." "I know she is engaged to Samuel Bridger, but I hope you will consider my suit instead. I have a prosperous ranch, money in the bank, and I can provide well for Zelda. I will pay you double whatever bride price Samuel offered, and I give you my word that she will be treated with respect and kindness all her days." The silence that followed was deafening. Tobias stared at Quinton with an expression of pure fury while Martha gasped and Zelda stood frozen, afraid to breathe. "You dare come into my home and try to steal my daughter," Tobias finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You, who have been sneaking around behind my back, filling her head with more nonsense about books and learning." "I have not been sneaking, sir. Zelda has visited my ranch as a guest, always properly chaperoned by Mrs. Patterson. There has been no impropriety. You think I care about propriety?" Tobias shouted, losing his composure. "You have been encouraging her in precisely the behavior I am trying to correct. Samuel Bridger will make a proper wife of her. You would only make her worse. The answer is no. Now get out of my house." "Zelda is a grown woman," Quinton said steadily, though Zelda could see the tension in his shoulders. "She should have some say in who she marries. She is my daughter, and she will do as I command. Now I said get out, or I will fetch my shotgun and help you along." Quinton met Zelda's eyes across the room. In that moment she saw the question there, the offer. He would take her away right now if she gave the word, consequences be damned. But she thought of her mother, of the violence her father was capable of, and she gave a tiny shake of her head. "I am sorry to have disturbed your evening," Quinton said formally. He put his hat back on and left, but not before giving Zelda one last look filled with such longing that it nearly broke her resolve. The moment the door closed, Tobias rounded on his daughter. "You will never see that man again. Do you understand me? No more visits to Mrs. Patterson. No more trips into town without me or your mother accompanying you. You will stay in this house until the wedding, and if you even think about running off, I will make certain Samuel knows exactly what kind of damaged goods he is getting." Zelda fled to her room and cried herself to sleep, clutching the volume of Wuthering Heights she had hidden in her mattress. She felt like Catherine Earnshaw, torn between duty and desire, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. The next 2 weeks were a prison sentence. Tobias watched her constantly, and when he had to be at work, he arranged for her aunt, a bitter woman who had never approved of Zelda's reading, to stay with her and Martha. The wedding was now less than 10 days away, and Zelda could see no escape, but Quinton had not given up. He began courting public opinion in town, quietly letting it be known that he had made an honorable offer for Zelda's hand and been refused, that he was willing to pay handsomely for the privilege of marrying her. The story spread through Fort Garland like wildfire, and people began to whisper. Samuel Bridger heard the rumors and confronted Tobias in front of the general store, demanding to know if it was true that another man was sniffing around his intended bride. Tobias assured him that everything was settled and that Zelda would marry him as planned. But Samuel's eyes were cold and angry when he left. On Thursday afternoon, 1 week before the scheduled wedding, Samuel rode out to the Xavier ranch. Quinton was working on fencing in the north pasture when one of his men came galloping up with the news that Bridger was at the main house demanding to speak with him. Quinton rode back immediately, his heart hammering with apprehension. He found Samuel waiting on the porch, his bulk settled into one of the chairs as though he owned the place. "Bridger," Quinton greeted him cautiously. "What brings you out this way?" "Heard some interesting stories in town," Samuel said, not bothering with pleasantries. "About you trying to buy my bride out from under me. Thought we should have a talk man to man." "I made an honest offer to her father," Quinton said evenly. "There was nothing underhanded about it, except that you have been entertaining her here at your ranch alone for weeks now." "That sounds pretty underhanded to me. She was always chaperoned by Mrs. Patterson. There was never anything improper." Samuel stood, and despite being shorter than Quinton, his bulk was intimidating. "Here is how this is going to work, Xavier. You are going to stay away from Zelda Carson. You are not going to speak to her, look at her, or think about her. She is mine, bought and paid for. If I hear that you have tried to contact her again, things are going to get ugly. I have friends who would be happy to teach you some manners. Do we understand each other?" Quinton felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I understand that you are a bully who thinks he can own a woman like property, but Zelda is a person with her own mind and her own desires. If she chooses to marry you, I will respect that choice. But I will not be threatened into silence." Samuel's face turned an ugly red. "You sanctimonious son of a—" He took a swing at Quinton, who dodged and backed away. "I will not fight you, Bridger. Get off my property." "Coward," Samuel spat. "That is what you are, all talk and no backbone. Let me tell you something about your precious Zelda. Once she is my wife, the first thing I am going to do is burn every book she has ever touched. And if she objects, I will teach her what happens to disobedient wives. My first wife learned that lesson well before she died." The admission was chilling in its casualness. Quinton stared at Samuel, seeing clearly for the first time the monster beneath the respectable rancher facade. "You are threatening to hurt her." "I am promising to discipline my wife as I see fit," Samuel said with a cruel smile. "And there is not a damn thing you or anyone else can do about it. Now stay away from what is mine." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Quinton standing on the porch with his fists clenched and his mind racing. He could not let Zelda marry this man. Samuel had all but admitted to killing his first wife, and he clearly intended to abuse Zelda if she did not submit completely to his will. Quinton rode into town that evening and went directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Morrison was a fair man in his late 50s who had served as a lawman for over 20 years. "Quinton," he greeted him with a nod. "What can I do for you?" "I need to report a threat," Quinton said. "Samuel Bridger came to my ranch today and essentially admitted to killing his first wife. He also threatened to harm Zelda Carson once they are married if she does not obey him." Morrison sighed heavily. "I have long suspected something was not right about how Sarah Bridger died. But without proof or witnesses, my hands are tied. As for threatening to discipline his future wife, that is not illegal, Quinton. The law gives a man considerable rights over his spouse. So you are telling me there is nothing you can do?" "I am telling you that the law is limited in how it can protect women in these situations," Morrison said. "My advice: convince the girl to run. If she leaves of her own free will before the wedding, Bridger cannot force her to return. She would be breaking a social contract, but not a legal one." Quinton thanked him and left, his mind churning with plans. He needed to get a message to Zelda, but her father was keeping her under virtual house arrest. Mrs. Patterson might be able to help, but he was reluctant to involve the older woman in something that could become dangerous. The solution came from an unexpected source. On Sunday morning, Quinton attended church and positioned himself where he could see the Carson family. Zelda looked pale and thin, as though she had not been eating or sleeping well. When the service ended, he made no move to approach her, but he caught the eye of Martha Carson, Zelda's mother. There was something in Martha's expression, a quiet desperation that gave him hope. He waited until Tobias was deep in conversation with another man, then approached her carefully. "Mrs. Carson, forgive my boldness, but I need to get a message to your daughter." Martha glanced nervously at her husband. "Mr. Xavier, I cannot, please," he said quietly. "Samuel Bridger is a dangerous man. He told me himself that he intends to hurt Zelda if she does not obey him perfectly. I cannot stand by and let that happen. Can you?" Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I have tried to protect her, but her father is so stubborn. He thinks Samuel will be good for her, that she needs a strong hand. She needs someone who will love and respect her, not break her spirit," Quinton said urgently. "I can offer her that, but I need her to come to me willingly. Can you help her?" For a long moment, Martha said nothing, and Quinton thought she would refuse, but then she nodded almost imperceptibly. "The wedding is in 6 days. Thursday night, Tobias will be at a planning meeting for the Harvest Festival. He will not return until late. If Zelda were to slip out then, it would be hours before he noticed." "Thank you," Quinton breathed. "Tell her to meet me at the north edge of town, near the old water tower, at 8 o'clock. I will have horses ready." Martha's hand trembled as she reached out and briefly touched his arm. "Take care of my girl, Mr. Xavier. Give her the life she deserves. I give you my word." The next days were agony for Quinton as he made preparations. He withdrew money from the bank, enough to see them through several months. He wrote to his sister in Santa Fe, explaining the situation and asking if they could stay with her until they sorted out their next steps. He spoke to his ranch foreman, a reliable man named Dutch Chambers, about running the place in his absence. "How long you planning to be gone?" Dutch asked. "A few months at least," Quinton said. "Maybe longer. I am eloping with a woman whose family does not approve of the match. There may be trouble." Dutch, who had known violence in his own past, nodded gravely. "I will keep the place running smooth. You take care of that girl." Thursday arrived with ominous clouds building over the mountains, promising a rare summer storm. Zelda spent the day in a state of barely controlled panic, terrified that her father would somehow discover the plan, or that her courage would fail her at the last moment. Her mother had passed her Quinton's message 2 days earlier while they were alone in the kitchen, and Zelda had been counting the hours ever since. She packed a small bag with her few personal possessions, mostly clothes, and the 2 books she had hidden in her room. She wore her sturdy traveling dress and boots, and she braided her hair in a practical style. At 7:30, while her father was at his meeting and her mother was in the parlor sewing, Zelda slipped out her bedroom window and ran. The town was quiet in the gathering dusk. Most people were inside preparing for the storm, and Zelda made it to the old water tower without being seen. Quinton was waiting with 2 horses already saddled, his own bag tied behind his saddle. "You came," he said, and she could hear the relief in his voice. "Did you think I would not?" "I was afraid you might change your mind. Are you certain about this, Zelda? Once we leave, there is no going back. Your father will disown you. The town will call you a runaway bride. It will not be easy." She moved close to him, looking up into his face in the fading light. "I would rather face a hard life with you than a comfortable one with Samuel Bridger. I love you, Quinton Xavier. I think I have loved you since the day you picked up my bookmark in the street." He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her then, a gentle kiss full of promise and hope. "I love you too. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone. We are going to have a good life, Zelda. I promise you that." They rode hard through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Fort Garland before the alarm was raised. The storm broke around midnight, drenching them in cold rain, but they pushed on. By dawn, they were 30 miles south, well on their way to Santa Fe. They stopped at a small town called San Luis, where Quinton knew a justice of the peace who would perform a marriage ceremony without asking too many questions. By noon on Friday, they were legally married, and Zelda Carson became Zelda Xavier. "How do you feel?" Quinton asked as they shared a simple meal at the town's only hotel. "Terrified," Zelda admitted. "Exhilarated, free. I cannot believe we actually did it." "Your father is going to come after us," Quinton said seriously. "And probably Samuel too. We need to be prepared for that." "I know. But we will face it together." They continued to Santa Fe, arriving 5 days later at the home of Quinton's sister. Hannah Xavier was a petite woman in her late 20s with her brother's dark eyes and a warm smile. She welcomed them without judgment, offering them a room in her comfortable adobe house and assuring them they could stay as long as they needed. "Quinton wrote me about you," Hannah told Zelda over dinner that first night. "He said you love books as much as our mother did." "That is high praise from him." "Your brother built me a library," Zelda said, still amazed by the memory. "Before I even agreed to marry him, he built me a place to read and study." Hannah's eyes grew misty. "That sounds like something our father would have done for Mother." "You are good for each other, I can tell." Life in Santa Fe was strange and wonderful. The city was larger than Fort Garland, more cosmopolitan, with a mix of Mexican, American, and native cultures that created a vibrant atmosphere. Zelda explored the markets, marveled at the architecture, and devoured the books in Hannah's personal collection. But the peace could not last forever. 3 weeks after their arrival, a letter came from Fort Garland. It was from Martha, smuggled out through a friend who was traveling south. The letter was brief and heartbreaking. "Your father is consumed with rage," Martha wrote. "He has sworn to find you and drag you back, married or not. Samuel Bridger is even worse. He has put out word that there is a reward for information about your whereabouts. Please be careful, my darling girl. I am glad you escaped, even if it means I may never see you again. Know that I love you and I am proud of your courage." Quinton read the letter over Zelda's shoulder, his expression grim. "We cannot stay here. Hannah is known to be my sister. If your father or Samuel comes looking, this will be the first place they check." "Where can we go?" Zelda asked. "I have been thinking about Colorado Springs," Quinton said. "It is a growing city, large enough that we can disappear but close enough to Fort Garland that I can keep an eye on my ranch. Dutch can send me reports, and we can decide later whether it is safe to return." They left Santa Fe 2 days later, with tearful goodbyes from Hannah and promises to write often. The journey north took them through some of the most beautiful country Zelda had ever seen, and despite the circumstances, she found herself feeling hopeful. She was married to a man who loved her, who encouraged her reading and valued her thoughts. Whatever hardships lay ahead, they would face them together. Colorado Springs proved to be everything they hoped for. The city was thriving, fueled by mining money and the arrival of the railroad. They rented a small house on the outskirts of town and settled into a quiet life. Quinton found work as a foreman on a large cattle operation, while Zelda took in sewing and mending to contribute to their income. For 6 months, they lived in peace. Quinton received regular reports from Dutch that the ranch was doing well. Zelda discovered she was pregnant, news that filled them both with joy and trepidation. They talked for hours about the future, about raising children who would grow up surrounded by books and love, who would be taught to think for themselves and question the world around them. But in March of 1884, their peaceful existence shattered. Quinton came home one evening to find Zelda white-faced and shaking, holding a letter. "What is it?" he asked, taking her in his arms. "It is from my mother. My father is dead. He was killed 3 weeks ago in a fire at the livery stable." Quinton held her while she cried, her grief complicated by years of difficult history with Tobias. When the tears finally subsided, she showed him the rest of the letter. "My mother says that Samuel Bridger is still looking for me," Zelda said. "But without my father to help him, his search has been less focused. She thinks it might be safe for us to visit if we are careful." "What do you want to do?" Quinton asked. Zelda was quiet for a long moment. "I want to see my mother. And I want to go home to the ranch, to the library you built for me. I am tired of running and hiding. Samuel Bridger does not own me. He has no legal claim on me. I am your wife, and I want to live my life without fear." Quinton cupped her face in his hands. "Then that is what we will do. But we do it smart. I will write to Sheriff Morrison, make sure he knows we are coming and that we expect his protection if Samuel causes trouble. We will not sneak in like criminals. We will return with our heads held high." They made the journey to Fort Garland in late March, arriving on a cool spring morning when the mountains were still capped with snow, but wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the valley. The town looked exactly as Zelda remembered, and she felt a complicated mix of emotions as they rode down the main street. News of their arrival spread quickly. By the time they reached Martha's house, a small crowd had gathered. Zelda dismounted and walked to the door, Quinton close behind her. Martha opened it before she could knock, and mother and daughter fell into each other's arms, weeping. "Let me look at you," Martha said finally, holding Zelda at arm's length. Her eyes went to the small swell of Zelda's belly, barely visible beneath her dress. "Oh, my dear, a baby." "Due in August," Zelda confirmed. "Mother, I am so sorry about Father. I know things were difficult between us, but I never wished him harm." "I know, sweet girl. He was not an easy man, but he was my husband and I mourn him. Come inside, both of you. You must be exhausted from traveling." They spent 3 days with Martha, filling her in on their life in Colorado Springs and making plans for the future. On the 4th day, Quinton and Zelda rode out to the ranch, both nervous and excited to see it again. The place looked even better than when they had left. Dutch had managed things well and the property was prosperous. But Zelda's eyes went immediately to the small building Quinton had built for her, the library that she had only seen once before they fled. "Can we look inside?" she asked. Quinton smiled and produced a key. "I had Dutch install a lock to keep the weather and critters out. It has been waiting for you." They walked across the yard hand in hand, and Quinton unlocked the door. The interior was exactly as Zelda remembered, perfect and waiting. Quinton had clearly arranged for the books to be moved from the main house because every shelf was now filled, the volumes organized and cared for. But there was something new. In the center of the room stood a beautiful desk of polished wood, and on it was a leather-bound journal and a pen. Beside the journal was a small card in Quinton's handwriting. "For your stories. The world deserves to hear your voice too." Zelda picked up the journal with trembling hands, too moved to speak. She had read so many books, dreamed so many dreams, but it had never occurred to her that she might create something of her own. "I thought you might want to write," Quinton said softly. "You have such a beautiful way with words when we talk about books. I would love to read stories of your own creation." She turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "How did I get so lucky to find you? I think I am the lucky one, he said, pulling her close. Not many men get to spend their lives with a woman who challenges them and inspires them and makes them better than they were. You do all that for me, Zelda. They stood in the library for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the books that had brought them together. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle and the calls of the ranch hands. This was their life now, hard work and simple pleasures and love that grew deeper every day. The confrontation with Samuel Bridger came that evening. He rode up to the ranch just as the sun was setting, accompanied by 2 hired men who looked like they were more comfortable with guns than with cattle. Quinton met them on the porch, his own rifle held loosely in one hand. "Bridger," he said evenly, "this is private property. State your business." "I have come for what is mine," Samuel said, his eyes searching for Zelda. "That woman ran out on our wedding. She owes me." "That woman is my legal wife," Quinton replied. "We were married by a justice of the peace in San Luis. I have the papers to prove it. She owes you nothing." "She is a thief and a runaway. Her father accepted my money." "Her father is dead, and any debt he incurred died with him. Zelda is staying here with me. If you have a legal claim, take it up with the courts. Otherwise, get off my land." Samuel's face turned purple with rage. "You think you can steal from me and get away with it? I will see you both dead before I let that happen." The threat hung in the air like poison. Behind Quinton, the door opened and Zelda stepped out, her hand protectively on her belly. She looked at Samuel with contempt. "I was never yours to steal, Mr. Bridger. I am a human being, not property. I chose to marry Quinton because he treats me with respect and kindness, because he loves me for who I am, not who he can force me to become. You need to accept that and move on with your life." "You made a fool of me," Samuel hissed. "Left me standing at the altar like an idiot. You will pay for that humiliation." "The only fool here is you," Zelda said firmly. "A real man would have let me go with grace. But you cannot do that because you never cared about me as a person. You just wanted someone to bully and control. I pity you, Mr. Bridger. What a sad, small life you must lead." For a moment, Quinton thought Samuel might actually attack. His hand moved toward his gun, and the tension ratcheted up to a dangerous level. But then Sheriff Morrison rode up with 2 deputies, clearly having been tipped off about Samuel's presence. "Evening, gentlemen," Morrison said calmly. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem, Sheriff," Quinton said, not taking his eyes off Samuel. "Mr. Bridger was just leaving." "That's so, Sam?" Morrison asked. "Because I have been hearing some concerning things about you threatening folks. Might be time for us to have a conversation about how threats of violence are handled in my jurisdiction." Samuel glared at all of them, but he was smart enough to recognize when he was outmatched. "This is not over," he said to Quinton. "Yes, it is," Morrison said flatly. "You make any more threats or bother these people again, I will arrest you for harassment and disturbing the peace. That is a promise. Now go on home and think about what you want your future to look like." Reluctantly, Samuel and his men rode off. Morrison tipped his hat to Quinton and Zelda. "Welcome home, folks. I will keep an eye on Bridger. He is all bluster, but I will make sure he knows there are consequences if he steps out of line." After the sheriff left, Quinton and Zelda went back inside, both shaking with adrenaline. They held each other in the gathering darkness, grateful for the support of the law and the community that had, in the end, chosen to protect them. The weeks that followed were busy ones. Quinton threw himself back into running the ranch, working alongside his men to repair fences, brand new calves, and prepare for the summer grazing season. Zelda made the house a home, adding curtains and rugs and small touches that reflected her personality. But her favorite place was always the library. She began writing in the journal Quinton had given her, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. She wrote stories about women on the frontier, women who fought against the constraints of their society to build lives of meaning and purpose. She wrote about love that transcended social conventions, about the power of literacy and education, about finding beauty in harsh landscapes. Martha visited often, delighted to watch her daughter bloom in the supportive environment Quinton had created. She helped prepare the nursery for the coming baby and shared stories about Zelda's childhood that made them all laugh. In June, Hannah came from Santa Fe for a visit and fell in love with Fort Garland. She ended up staying, opening a small school for children in the town. She and Zelda became fast friends, bonded by their shared love of learning and their determination to make education accessible to everyone, not just the privileged few. Samuel Bridger proved to be less of a threat than they had feared. After his confrontation with the sheriff, he seemed to lose interest in pursuing Zelda. Rumors circulated that he had begun courting a widow from a neighboring county, a woman who, by all accounts, was as tough and mean-spirited as he was. They deserved each other, Zelda thought without malice. August arrived with blistering heat and afternoon thunderstorms that rolled over the mountains like clockwork. Zelda's pregnancy advanced, and she grew large and uncomfortable, though Quinton treated her like precious porcelain. On August 15th, after a labor that lasted through the night, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas, after Quinton's father, and he was perfect. Quinton wept when he held his son for the first time, overcome with the responsibility and joy of fatherhood. Martha stayed for 2 weeks to help, teaching Zelda how to care for an infant and sharing the wisdom of her own experience. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family and quiet contentment. Quinton expanded the ranch, buying adjacent property and increasing his herds. Zelda continued to write, and when Hannah suggested she submit some of her stories to magazines in the East, Zelda was shocked when several were accepted for publication. She began earning money from her writing, a contribution to the family income that filled her with pride. 2 years after Thomas was born, Zelda gave birth to a daughter they named Caroline, after Quinton's mother. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and she was stubborn and curious from the moment she entered the world. The library became the heart of their home. As the children grew, Quinton and Zelda would read to them every evening, sharing stories of adventure and romance, teaching them letters and numbers, encouraging their natural curiosity about the world. Hannah brought her students to visit sometimes, showing them that books were not just for the wealthy, that knowledge belonged to everyone who sought it. Fort Garland changed slowly over the years. Hannah's school thrived, and literacy rates in the town began to climb. Other women, inspired by Zelda's example, began to speak up about their own desires for education and self-determination. It was not a revolution, just a gradual shift in attitudes that created space for different ways of thinking about women's roles. On a cool evening in October of 1889, Quinton and Zelda sat together in the library after putting the children to bed. Thomas, now 5, was already reading simple books on his own. Caroline, at 3, demanded stories every night and had memorized several by heart. "You remember the day we met?" Zelda asked, leaning against Quinton's shoulder. "When you picked up my bookmark in the street. I remember thinking that any woman who loved books enough to be shoved into the street for them was worth knowing," Quinton said with a smile. "I remember how the sunlight caught in your hair and how fierce you looked, clutching that volume of Shakespeare like it was the most precious thing in the world. It was, to me. Books were my only escape from a life I did not want." She looked around the room at the shelves filled with volumes they had collected together over the years. You gave me so much more than a library, Quinton. You gave me freedom. The freedom to be myself, to pursue my passions, to think and dream and create. You gave me just as much, he said, kissing the top of her head. You taught me that love is not about ownership or control. It is about supporting each other's growth, celebrating each other's victories, being partners in building a life. I am a better man because I loved you. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, dusting the mountains with white. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, and the book stood witness to their happiness. Zelda thought about how far she had come from that terrified girl, who had been shamed for loving literature. She had built a life that honored her passions, married a man who valued her mind as much as her heart, raised children who would grow up knowing that knowledge was power, and that love could transform everything. In 1892, Zelda published her first full-length novel, a story about a woman on the frontier who fought against her family's expectations to become a teacher. It was well received in literary circles, and she began work on a second book almost immediately. Quinton was her first reader and her most enthusiastic supporter, offering feedback and encouragement whenever she doubted her abilities. The ranch continued to prosper. Quinton hired more men, built better facilities, and earned a reputation as a fair employer who treated his workers with respect. He was known throughout the valley as an honest dealer who could be trusted to keep his word. Several young cowboys sought positions with him specifically because they knew he ran a decent operation. Thomas showed an early aptitude for ranching, following his father around and asking endless questions about the cattle and the land. Caroline, meanwhile, proved to have her mother's love of books and her father's head for business. By age 7, she was helping her mother organize the library and had begun writing her own stories. In 1895, Quinton and Zelda welcomed their third child, another son they named Daniel. He was a happy, easygoing baby who rarely cried and smiled at everyone. Martha, now in her late 50s, doted on all her grandchildren and spent most of her time at the ranch, having sold the house in town and moved into a small cottage on the property that Quinton had built for her. Hannah married in 1896, choosing a widower named Robert Sterling who had a young daughter. Robert was a lawyer who had moved to Fort Garland to escape the stress of city life, and he and Hannah were perfectly matched in temperament and values. Their wedding was held at the ranch, with half the town in attendance, and Zelda served as Hannah's matron of honor. Samuel Bridger faded from their lives entirely. He married his widow and moved to Wyoming, where reports suggested he was as unpleasant as ever but at least focused his energies elsewhere. Zelda rarely thought of him anymore, except occasionally to feel grateful that she had escaped a fate that would have destroyed her spirit. The library continued to grow. Quinton made it his mission to acquire books on every subject he could find, from science and philosophy to poetry and fiction. He established a lending system for the community, allowing anyone who wished to borrow volumes from their collection. Some of the townspeople took advantage of the offer, though others remained suspicious of too much learning. But slowly, attitudes shifted. As more children learned to read at Hannah's school, more parents began to see the value of education. Women started attending lectures that Hannah organized, discussing everything from current events to literature to women's suffrage. Fort Garland would never be a center of progressive thought, but it became a more open-minded place than it had been. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Quinton and Zelda celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary. Their children were growing into remarkable young people. Thomas, at 15, was already working the ranch alongside his father and making plans to expand their operations. Caroline, at 13, had published her first story in a children's magazine and dreamed of becoming a professional writer like her mother. Daniel, at 5, was the family charmer, able to sweet-talk his way out of almost any trouble. They held a party at the ranch, inviting friends and family from miles around. The library had been expanded twice over the years and now held over 300 volumes. A second story had been added to the building, creating a reading room upstairs with large windows that looked out over the mountains. As Zelda stood in the library surrounded by the people she loved, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She thought of the frightened girl she had been, shamed for loving books, trapped by her father's expectations and society's narrow definition of what a woman should be. She thought of the courage it had taken to run away with Quinton, to trust in love even when the world seemed determined to punish them for it. "What are you thinking about?" Quinton asked, coming to stand beside her with his arm around her waist. "About how blessed I am," Zelda said. "About how one act of kindness, you picking up my bookmark, changed the entire trajectory of my life." "I think we changed each other's trajectories," Quinton said. "I was drifting before I met you, working hard but with no real purpose beyond making money. You gave me something to build for, someone to be better for. You made me understand what really matters in life." They looked out the window together at the mountains painted gold by the setting sun. Below them, their children played with cousins and friends, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. In the corrals, the cattle settled in for the night. Somewhere in the house, Martha was probably organizing something that did not need organizing because she could never sit still. Hannah and Robert would be leaving soon, needing to get their daughter home before dark. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary life, except that it was not ordinary at all. It was extraordinary because it was built on love and respect, and the radical notion that women deserved the same freedoms and opportunities as men. It was extraordinary because Quinton and Zelda had refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on them, choosing instead to create their own path. As the years continued to pass, their life together deepened and matured. They faced challenges, of course, droughts and harsh winters, sick cattle and financial setbacks. In 1903, they lost Martha to pneumonia, and Zelda grieved deeply for the mother who had ultimately found the courage to help her escape. But through everything, their partnership remained strong. Thomas married at 21, choosing a smart, capable woman named Sarah who shared his passion for ranching. They built a house on the northern section of the property and began raising their own family. Caroline attended a women's college in Denver, studying literature and writing, and returned to Fort Garland determined to open a bookstore. Quinton and Zelda helped her finance the venture, and it became a gathering place for readers throughout the valley. Daniel, it turned out, had a gift for numbers and decided to pursue a career in banking. He moved to Colorado Springs but visited often, bringing his parents news from the wider world and pride in what his family had built. In 1910, Quinton and Zelda celebrated their 26th anniversary. They were in their 50s now, their hair streaked with gray but their love as strong as ever. They spent the day in the library, as they had on so many important occasions, talking about the life they had built and the legacy they would leave. "We should write our story," Zelda said suddenly. "For the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren who will come after, so they know how it all began." "You should write it," Quinton said. "You are the storyteller in this family." So Zelda began the project, spending her evenings at the desk Quinton had given her all those years ago, chronicling their love story. She wrote about fear and courage, about the power of books to change lives, about the importance of building a world where women could pursue their passions without shame. The manuscript grew over months, and then years. She showed chapters to Quinton as she completed them, and he would offer suggestions or remind her of details she had forgotten. Sometimes they would sit together and laugh over shared memories. Other times they would cry, remembering the hardships they had overcome. By 1915, the book was finished. Zelda sent it to her publisher in New York, where it was accepted enthusiastically. The Cowboy's Library, a true story of love and literature on the frontier, was published in 1916 to considerable acclaim. It became a bestseller, touching hearts across the country and inspiring other women to pursue their own dreams of education and independence. Letters poured in from readers who saw their own struggles reflected in Zelda's story. Women wrote to thank her for showing them that change was possible, that love could be a partnership rather than a prison. Men wrote too, some confessing that the book had changed how they thought about their wives and daughters, making them understand the importance of supporting women's aspirations. The money from the book allowed Quinton and Zelda to establish a scholarship fund for young women seeking education. They worked with Hannah's school, which had evolved into a full secondary institution, to identify promising students who lacked the financial means to pursue their studies. Over the years, dozens of young women received support, going on to become teachers, writers, nurses, and even doctors. As they aged, Quinton and Zelda spent more and more time in their beloved library. It had become a sanctuary, a place where they could escape the demands of the world and simply be together surrounded by the books that had brought them to each other. They would read aloud to each other as they had in the early days of their courtship, sharing favorite passages and discovering new authors. Their love had mellowed over the years, but never diminished. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other good morning and good night, still talked for hours about everything and nothing. They had built a life that honored both their shared passions and their individual dreams, creating space for each other to grow while remaining deeply connected. In the spring of 1925, Quinton fell ill with a fever that would not break. The doctor came from town, but there was little he could do beyond make Quinton comfortable. Zelda sat by his bedside for 3 days, holding his hand and reading to him from their favorite books. Their children and grandchildren gathered, filling the house with quiet concern. On the 3rd night, Quinton opened his eyes and looked at Zelda with perfect clarity. "It has been a good life," he whispered. "The best life. I love you, my Zelda, my brave, brilliant girl." "I love you too," she said through her tears. "Thank you for building me a library. Thank you for giving me freedom. Thank you for filling my life with beauty and meaning," he replied. "The books, the children, the years we have had together, all of it has been more than I ever dreamed possible." He died peacefully just before dawn, slipping away while Zelda held him and whispered words of love. She was 64 years old, and she had just lost the love of her life, her partner of 41 years. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from throughout the valley. Quinton had been respected and loved, known for his fairness, his kindness, and his devotion to his family. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with the mountains visible in the distance, and the library he had built standing as a monument to his love. Zelda grieved deeply but did not break. She had Quinton's strength in her, the resilience he had always admired. She continued to live at the ranch, cared for by Thomas and Sarah, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She wrote another book, a memoir about her life with Quinton, and she spent her days in the library he had created for her. On quiet afternoons, she would sit in the reading room upstairs and remember. She would think about the scared girl who had been shamed for loving books, about the cowboy who had seen her worth when no one else did, about the life they had built together against all odds. She would touch the spines of the books they had collected, each one a memory, a shared experience, a piece of their story. Zelda lived to be 82 years old, passing peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1943. She died in the library, surrounded by books, exactly as she would have wanted. Her children found her in the morning, a smile on her face, a volume of poetry open in her lap. They buried her next to Quinton on the hillside, and the entire valley mourned the loss of a woman who had inspired so many to pursue their dreams. Her books continued to be read, her scholarship fund continued to support young women, and the library stood as a testament to the power of love to transform lives. The ranch stayed in the family for generations. Thomas's children and grandchildren continued to work the land, but they also maintained the library with reverence, understanding that it represented something far more important than just a collection of books. It represented the courage to defy convention, the power of love to overcome obstacles, and the belief that every person deserves the freedom to pursue their passions. Visitors came from across the country to see the famous library, to stand in the room where Zelda Xavier had written her groundbreaking novels, to feel the presence of a love story that had changed how people thought about marriage and partnership. The building was eventually donated to the town of Fort Garland and turned into a museum and working library, ensuring that future generations would have access to the knowledge and beauty that Quinton and Zelda had valued so deeply. And so the story of the girl who was shamed for loving books and the cowboy who built her a library became legend. It was told to children as a bedtime story, studied in schools as an example of frontier literature, and remembered by anyone who had ever felt constrained by society's expectations. It was a reminder that love, when true and deep, could build bridges across any divide, could create beauty in the harshest circumstances, and could leave a legacy that endured long after the lovers themselves had passed into memory. In the end, Zelda and Quinton's greatest achievement was not the successful ranch or the published books or the money they had accumulated. It was the life they had built together, founded on mutual respect, shared passion, and the radical notion that both partners in a marriage deserved to pursue their dreams. They had proven that love did not require one person to diminish themselves for the other, that true partnership meant supporting each other's growth, and that the most revolutionary act was simply treating each other with kindness and respect. Their library stood for over 100 years, a monument to a cowboy's love and a woman's courage, sheltering readers and dreamers and reminding everyone who entered that books had the power to change lives, that love could overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the most extraordinary stories were the true ones.